The year was 1945, and the Pacific was a battleground, with the Allied forces pushing toward Japan's home islands. Aboard the USS Saratoga, an American aircraft carrier, there was an unusual sense of calm. The sailors, who had endured months of combat, were granted a brief respite from the ceaseless war. The sound of waves crashing against the ship and the occasional hum of aircraft engines filled the air, but there was an underlying tension. The soldiers knew that soon they would be heading into the heart of enemy territory, where battles would rage once again. For the moment, however, there was a rare pause in the violence. The sailors, weary from the constant threat of enemy fire, spent this rare downtime in small moments of tranquility. Some were sprawled on the deck, resting their eyes or writing letters to loved ones back home. Others played cards, while a few stood near the edge of the ship, gazing out over the endless expanse of water. The sea seemed vast and undisturbed, stretching out like an endless sheet of blue. They had all heard stories of the horrors they would soon face, but for now they allowed themselves to forget, if only for a moment, the war that loomed on the horizon. The air was hot, heavy with the salty tang of the ocean, and the sky was a clear blue, unmarred by clouds. The ship creaked under the weight of its purpose, and the sailors moved through their routines, still wary of what might come next. The ship had been at sea for months, and the men had become accustomed to the rhythm of life aboard the Saratoga. Even in moments like this, when the tension should have been eased, there was always the gnawing knowledge that the war could resume at any moment. For the men on board, every day was a reminder of their duty. They had grown used to the idea that their lives could be cut short in an instant. There was no time to question the war or the reasons behind it. All that mattered was survival and the mission at hand. Their eyes, though trained on the distant horizon, were ever watchful, scanning for any sign of danger. But on that day, there was no sign of impending attack, no enemy planes or ships on the radar. The world seemed almost peaceful, as if the chaos of war had been momentarily paused by some higher power. But in the distance, beyond the calm of the sea, there was a storm waiting to unfold. News had reached them of the imminent landing on Okinawa, the final battleground before the Japanese homeland. The men of the USS Saratoga knew their next mission would not be like the others. This time, they were headed straight into the heart of the enemy's territory. The air was thick with the anticipation of the unknown, but for the time being, they tried to ignore the unease that gnawed at them. As they sat in the relative safety of the ship, they could only wonder about the people they would soon encounter on the islands. They knew little about the civilians of Okinawa, except for the rumors that had spread through the ranks. The Japanese were said to be fiercely loyal to their emperor, and the soldiers feared the civilians would be just as dangerous as the enemy combatants. The stories painted a picture of a people who would rather die than surrender, and the soldiers wondered if they would find themselves caught in the crossfire. On the ship, some men whispered about the horrors they had heard of in other parts of the Pacific, stories of civilians being forced into suicide missions, of villages destroyed, and of families torn apart by the war. They had seen the destruction firsthand, and now, as they prepared for what was to come, they could not shake the feeling that the people of Okinawa would be no different. But as the sun beat down on the ship and the men found fleeting moments of peace, it was hard to imagine that anything could break the calm. And yet, they knew deep down that this tranquility would not last. It was merely the calm before the storm. As much as they longed for a moment of respite, the reality of war was never far from their minds. They could feel it building, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. The soldiers knew that their time on this ship was limited, and soon they would face the fight of their lives. The quiet moments were precious, but fleeting. In just a few days, they would be thrust into the heart of battle, where every decision could mean life or death. The men tried to enjoy their brief respite, but even in the quiet, they couldn't escape the knowledge of the war that loomed ahead. They spent their time preparing for the unknown, sharpening their skills and steeling themselves for the horrors to come. They knew that the world they were about to enter would be unlike anything they had experienced before. The sea, once calm and welcoming, would soon become a battleground, and their lives would be forever changed. But for now, they held on to the peace of the moment, knowing that it would not last. The peaceful moment aboard the USS Saratoga was shattered by the arrival of a sudden, distressing report. American intelligence had confirmed that the Japanese were fortifying the island of Okinawa, preparing for a fierce defense. The atmosphere on the ship, once filled with the casual chatter of sailors enjoying a rare break, instantly shifted. Everyone knew that the upcoming mission would be unlike any they had faced before. The crew braced themselves for what was coming, and as they made their preparations, the quiet tension hung heavy in the air. In a matter of days, they would be in the thick of the fight, engaging the enemy in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. For Seaman Samuel "Sam" Hayes, a 22-year-old sailor from Ohio, this shift in mood struck deep. The news of the assault made everything feel suddenly real again. He had been aboard the Saratoga for nearly a year, and while he had seen his share of action, the stakes now seemed higher than ever. Sam had joined the Navy not just for the adventure, but because he believed in the mission. He knew that every action, every decision, could be the difference between life and death. But despite the weight of the situation, there was something else pushing him forward, a sense of duty, and a quiet resolve to do what was right, no matter the cost. The days leading up to the operation were filled with tense anticipation. The sailors spent hours preparing for battle, checking their equipment, reviewing their strategies, and performing drills. The closer they got to Okinawa, the more the reality of the situation sank in. The men of the Saratoga knew they would be landing on an island that would not surrender easily. The Japanese forces there were determined, and the island was known to be heavily defended. There would be no easy victories. They were preparing for one of the most intense fights of the entire war, and the uncertainty of it all loomed like a storm on the horizon. But for Sam, the uncertainty of war was nothing new. He had grown up in a small town where things were simple, and the biggest challenges came from everyday life. Joining the Navy had been his way of seeking purpose, and now, as he stood on the deck of the Saratoga, ready to embark on this mission, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the choices he had made. He had heard the stories of the brutality of the Japanese forces, the way they would fight until the last man, and how they would often sacrifice civilians to their cause. He had seen the destruction left behind in other battles, and he understood the stakes of the operation. Despite the fear and uncertainty, Sam felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had made a commitment to protect his fellow sailors and to do whatever it took to secure victory. The thought of being a hero, of saving lives in the face of danger, crossed his mind, but it wasn't about the glory. It was about the duty to his country, to the men around him, and to the greater cause. He knew what they were fighting for, and he was prepared to face whatever came next. There was no turning back now. As the Saratoga sailed closer to Okinawa, the anticipation among the crew grew. The men could feel the weight of history bearing down on them. This battle would determine the fate of the Pacific War, and every soldier on that ship knew they were part of something much larger than themselves. The thoughts of home, of loved ones waiting, had faded into the background. They were now soldiers, united in a common goal. The enemy was out there, waiting for them, and they would have to give everything to defeat it. It was during this period of reflection, as the ship neared Okinawa, that the unthinkable happened. While most of the sailors were either resting or preparing for the upcoming battle, the ship's crew received a distress call from a nearby Japanese fishing boat. The boat had been caught in the crossfire of the ongoing naval skirmishes, and it was sinking. The sailors on board had been tossed into the waves, and some of them were drowning. The call for help reached the Saratoga, and as Sam listened to the communication, a surge of urgency rose in him. He couldn't ignore the cry for help.
Without hesitation, Sam made his decision. He didn't wait for orders, didn't second-guess the situation. He dove into the cold, churning water, fully aware of the dangers. As the cold, salt water hit his skin, his heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed through the shock. The waves crashed against him, threatening to pull him under, but his focus was clear. There were people in need, and he was the one who could help. The ship's crew scrambled to send out lifeboats, but Sam had already taken the leap, instinctively understanding that every second counted. His arms cut through the water as he fought against the current, each stroke bringing him closer to the struggling sailors. The sight before him was one of chaos. Some of the men were already sinking beneath the waves, their limbs flailing in desperation. Others clung to debris, trying to keep themselves afloat. But Sam wasn't thinking of the danger. His mind was solely focused on the lives he could save. He reached out to grab one of the men, pulling him up and steadying him in the water. But as he did, a powerful wave surged beneath them, knocking them both off balance. For a moment, everything felt uncertain. The force of the ocean seemed overwhelming, and Sam felt the weight of the situation sinking in. But he didn't give up. He pressed on, using every ounce of his strength to keep the man afloat. As more sailors from the Saratoga arrived to assist, Sam's focus never wavered. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to do what was right, to ensure that as many lives as possible were saved. In the end, Sam knew that, no matter what happened, he had made the right choice. He had answered the call when it mattered most. The water was relentless, cold and unforgiving. Sam's muscles burned with exhaustion as he continued to swim toward the survivors, each stroke feeling heavier than the last. The waves pushed him back, threatening to drag him under, but he refused to let the current defeat him. He had seen death before, up close, and he knew that he couldn't allow it to claim any more lives if he could help it. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in gasps, but the cries for help from the drowning men drove him forward. Every second felt like an eternity, but Sam's determination was stronger than the pull of the sea. As Sam reached the first of the sailors struggling in the water, he could see the fear in their eyes that were wide with panic as they fought to stay afloat. The man was clutching a piece of driftwood, but his grip was weakening. Sam grabbed hold of his arm, pulling him up just enough to give him a breath of air. The sailor's face was pale, his body trembling from the cold, but he still had a spark of hope in his eyes. Sam nodded at him, silently reassuring him that he wasn't alone. It was a small gesture, but in the middle of the chaos, it was all that was needed. With the man in tow, Sam kicked his legs harder, propelling them both through the rough waters. The waves seemed to be getting stronger, each one crashing against them with greater force, threatening to separate them. Sam's arms were beginning to feel numb, but he fought through the pain, pulling the sailor closer to the lifeboats that had finally reached the scene. He could hear the shouts of his fellow sailors, their voices cutting through the noise of the ocean, and that gave him a renewed sense of purpose. There was no turning back now. The man needed him, and Sam wasn't going to give up. When they were finally close enough to the lifeboats, Sam handed the sailor over to the crew, watching as the man was hauled aboard, his body still shaking with cold. For a moment, Sam allowed himself a breath, but it was short-lived. The waves were still crashing around him, and the struggle wasn't over. He had saved one man, but there were still others who needed help, and Sam knew that he couldn't stop now. His legs ached with the effort, and his lungs burned from the salt water, but he pushed on. He turned back to the wreckage of the fishing boat, where he could see another sailor struggling to stay above the water. The man was about 50 feet away, but the distance felt like a mile in the chaotic swells of the ocean. Sam's body was exhausted, and every instinct told him to stop, to rest, but he couldn't. His mind was set on the mission. He had made a promise to himself when he first joined the Navy, and now was the time to honor that promise. He would not leave anyone behind, not while he still had strength left to fight. As he swam back toward the wreckage, the waves grew more violent, and the sound of the crashing surf grew louder. The wind had picked up, and the once calm water was now a turbulent sea of whitecaps and churning currents. Sam's body screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth and continued to swim. His hands were raw from the salt, his legs were heavy with fatigue, and yet he pressed forward, his eyes fixed on the sailor still struggling in the water. The ocean seemed to be fighting against him, but Sam was determined to win. Finally, he reached the sailor, whose face was barely visible above the waves. The man's eyes were wide with terror, his mouth open as he gasped for air. Sam grabbed him by the arm, pulling him toward him with all his remaining strength. The sailor was limp, his body barely moving, and Sam could feel his own energy draining with each second. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. With one final surge, Sam pulled the sailor toward the lifeboats, their destination now within sight. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but Sam fought through it, unwilling to let go of the life he was saving. When they finally reached the lifeboats, Sam felt himself nearly collapse. His arms were too tired to lift himself out of the water, but a pair of strong hands grabbed him, pulling him aboard. His body was numb from the cold, and he could barely breathe. But he had done it. He had saved 2 men. He had kept his promise. As he lay back on the cold boards of the lifeboat, Sam allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, just for a moment. The battle in the water was over, but the battle inside him, the one that had pushed him beyond his limits, was far from finished. As the lifeboat began to make its way back to the Saratoga, Sam could hear the sounds of the crew, shouting and congratulating each other. But for Sam, the victory didn't feel like triumph. There was no time for celebration. His body was broken, and his mind was heavy with the weight of the lives he had saved. The cost of those moments, the toll they had taken on him, was something he would carry with him long after the waves had settled. But for now, there was only relief. Relief that the men he had fought to save were alive, and that he had done what he set out to do. As the lifeboat made its slow, steady journey back to the USS Saratoga, Sam's body felt like it was shutting down. The cold salt water had soaked into every pore, and his muscles ached in ways he never thought possible. He lay flat on his back, barely able to move, only able to hear the creaking of the boat and the muffled voices of the sailors around him. The adrenaline that had carried him through the chaos of the ocean was beginning to wear off, and in its place came the heavy, overwhelming exhaustion. His entire body felt leaden, as though the weight of the ocean itself had become part of him. The warmth of the sun on his face was a cruel reminder of how much energy he had expended, and the cool breeze that swept across the boat only served to make him shiver. The survivors he had saved, still shaken but now safe, were huddled together at the other end of the boat. Their eyes were wide, their faces pale, and Sam could hear them muttering to each other in quiet, grateful tones. He knew that they would never forget the act of bravery that had saved their lives, but Sam wasn't concerned with recognition. He had done what he had to do because it was the right thing. It wasn't about glory or accolades. It was about the lives he had kept from being lost to the sea. Even though he had pulled 2 men from the brink of death, a deep sense of emptiness lingered in his chest. His thoughts began to drift, and he found himself thinking of the men who had been left behind, the ones who hadn't made it out of the water. His mind replayed the faces of those sailors, their eyes wide with panic as the waves overtook them. Despite all his efforts, there were still those who hadn't been saved, and Sam couldn't shake the guilt that weighed on him. He had done his best, but the ocean was a powerful and unforgiving force. He couldn't save everyone. That truth sat uncomfortably in his chest, a quiet, persistent ache that refused to be silenced. As the boat approached the Saratoga, Sam's thoughts turned to the battle that awaited them. Okinawa was just ahead, and the peaceful waters of the sea were about to be replaced with the violence of war. Sam had saved lives today,
but he knew that tomorrow would bring a different kind of fight. He wasn't sure how many would survive the coming battle, but he knew that it wouldn't be the last time he would face danger. The reality of war was ever present, and while he had managed to preserve life for a short time, he couldn't forget the bigger picture. His mind raced with the possibilities. What would the battle for Okinawa hold? How many more lives would be lost before it was over? The boat pulled up alongside the Saratoga, and Sam was lifted gently out of the boat by two of his fellow sailors. His legs felt weak, his arms shaky, but he managed to steady himself as he was helped up the ladder onto the deck. The men who had been saved were already on their feet, but Sam barely had the strength to walk. His body was exhausted, his energy drained, and as he stood on the deck, he realized just how close he had come to losing everything. He had given all of himself to save those men, and now he was left to grapple with the consequences of that choice. As he was escorted to the medical bay, Sam could hear the sound of the crew shouting orders, preparing for the impending attack. The Saratoga was getting ready to launch its planes and join the battle, and the urgency in the air was palpable. Sam was given a brief examination, but the doctors could see that he was in no condition to continue his duties. They told him to rest, but he could barely comprehend their words. His mind was clouded with the knowledge of the war ahead. His body ached, but it was the emotional toll that weighed heaviest on his mind. The battle for Okinawa was about to begin, and no matter how much he had given, the real fight was only just starting. The hours passed, and Sam's exhaustion grew deeper. He lay on a cot in the medical bay, his body surrounded by the sterile smells of disinfectant and the quiet murmur of medical personnel tending to other wounded sailors. His mind, though, was far from the comfort of the cot. He couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept drifting back to the men he had saved and the ones he hadn't. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he had experienced. He had seen war, he had seen death, but this felt different. This felt personal. His actions had consequences, and he would have to live with them. The doctor returned later, telling Sam that he was being taken off duty for the time being. Sam nodded but didn't speak. He didn't know if he was relieved or disappointed. He wanted to be back on the front lines, to continue fighting, but he knew his body was telling him something different. He had given everything he had, and his body was beginning to shut down in protest. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and even the thought of another battle seemed impossible to bear. But as he lay there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the ship and the distant sounds of preparation, Sam knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done yet. He still had more to give. When the time came, he would return to the fight. The ship continued to move toward Okinawa, and Sam's thoughts began to quiet. His body ached, but the sense of relief he felt from having saved lives, however brief, began to settle in. The sea had been unforgiving, but in the end, he had made a difference. He had done what he could, and that, he told himself, had to be enough. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the question that would stay with him for the rest of the war. How much more could he give before there was nothing left? The days that followed were filled with the bustle of preparation. The USS Saratoga remained steady as it sailed toward Okinawa, but the atmosphere aboard the ship had changed. There was no longer time for idle chatter or moments of respite. The crew, including Sam, knew what awaited them on the island, one of the deadliest battles in the Pacific. Sam's body, still weak from his ordeal in the ocean, struggled to keep up with the demands of a ship on high alert. Despite his exhaustion, he couldn't escape the sense of impending doom that seemed to hang over everyone aboard. Sam lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. His body ached, and every movement felt like a reminder of the toll the past days had taken on him. The memory of swimming through the violent waves, struggling to save two men, replayed over and over in his mind. But the deeper he tried to analyze the events, the more it all seemed like a blur. He had done what he could in the moment,
And while the gratitude from the sailors he saved had been overwhelming, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The lives he had saved didn't feel like enough when he thought of the men he hadn't reached. It was as if the waves had claimed them, and no amount of effort could bring them back.
The war, however, showed no mercy. The following morning, the ship was abuzz with activity as the sailors prepared for the invasion of Okinawa. The roar of engines, the clanging of metal, and the orders shouted over the loudspeakers became the soundtrack of Sam's life. He wanted nothing more than to help, to be back on his feet and ready for the fight, but his body wasn't cooperating. The medical staff had insisted that he stay in the medical bay for the time being, but Sam's mind was elsewhere. His heart was on the island, in the chaos that was about to unfold. He knew he had to be a part of it, despite the toll it would take on him. The ship's bell rang, signaling that the time had come. The crew was ready to move. As Sam watched from the medical bay, he felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The men who had fought beside him were preparing to face an enemy unlike any other. The thought of being left behind gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on his ability to rise to the occasion, but now his body was betraying him. It was as if the weight of the battle had already taken its toll, and he had yet to even set foot on Okinawa's soil. Despite the medical orders to rest, Sam couldn't stay idle for long. He knew that once the invasion began, there would be no time to reflect, no space for regrets. The weight of the war would settle in, and every decision, every move would matter. He longed to contribute, to help carry the burden that so many of his comrades had already accepted. But he also understood that his role was different now. The reality of war had made him realize that heroism didn't always come in the form of a dramatic rescue. Sometimes, survival itself was the greatest act of courage. As the days dragged on and the ship drew closer to Okinawa, Sam's thoughts began to turn inward. The ocean, the waves, the battle for survival, it had all become a blur of motion and sound. What had once been clear, his purpose, his mission, had now become muddled. The more he thought about the soldiers on the island, the more he realized that there was no clear way forward. There would be no easy answers, no simple victories. The reality of the fight ahead settled heavily on his chest. When the first bombs began to fall on Okinawa, Sam's heart raced in his chest. The island, which had once been distant and unfamiliar, was now a place of chaos and destruction. The Saratoga's engines roared as it surged toward the shores of the island, the sound of aircraft taking off reverberating in the air. Sam could feel the tremors of the bombs from the ship's deck, a constant reminder of the brutality of war. Yet, despite the devastation, he couldn't look away. His duty was to witness, to understand, and eventually to take action. But for now, he remained on the sidelines, waiting for his chance to return to the fight. As the days turned into nights, the battles raged on. The sounds of artillery fire echoed across the ocean, reaching the Saratoga's deck with an eerie familiarity. Sam could no longer deny the reality of the situation. He was part of something much bigger than himself. The island, once a quiet place in the Pacific, was now a battleground where lives would be lost and sacrifices would be made. He could feel the pressure building inside him, the weight of his own survival gnawing at him. He was alive, but for how long? Sam's thoughts returned to the ocean, to the men he had saved. He wondered what had become of them. Had they made it to safety? Or had the war claimed them too? The uncertainty of it all haunted him. He had done his part in the ocean, but the fight on land was far from over. And as the ship continued its journey toward the island, Sam knew that the true test was yet to come. The sacrifices made on that day, in the midst of the waves, would be nothing compared to the choices that lay ahead. In the final moments before the Saratoga reached Okinawa, Sam felt a surge of determination. His body was broken, but his mind was sharper than ever. The battle for Okinawa had begun, and whether he was ready or not,
He would play his part. He had saved lives once before, and though the path ahead was uncertain, he was prepared to face whatever came next. The war was far from over, but for Sam, the struggle had only just begun. As the battle for Okinawa raged on, Sam found himself back on the front lines. The days blurred together, long stretches of violence and uncertainty interspersed with brief moments of silence. His body had recovered enough to allow him to fight, but the emotional toll of the past days was something he couldn't shake. He had saved lives, but he had also seen death up close, and now he was living in its shadow. The memories of those he couldn't save, the faces of men who had drowned in the ocean or been lost in the smoke of battle, followed him like ghosts. The war had become a never-ending cycle of destruction. Each day, Sam woke to the sounds of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, and the thrum of helicopters overhead. The island of Okinawa, once lush and serene, was now a scarred battlefield. The men he fought beside, men he had grown to trust, were beginning to show the same wear and tear as the land they were fighting for. There were no more illusions about heroism or glory. The war was a brutal, grinding machine, and it was devouring everyone involved. Despite the chaos surrounding him, Sam found himself thinking back to that moment in the ocean when he had saved those two sailors. That decision, that impulse to jump into the water without hesitation, seemed so distant now. He had acted on instinct then, driven by the belief that he could make a difference. But here, on the island, in the midst of the fighting, that same sense of certainty was harder to find. Every life lost, every bullet fired, seemed to make the world feel more uncertain. He wasn't sure if the things he was doing mattered anymore. As Sam and his unit advanced deeper into the island, the landscape became increasingly treacherous. The Japanese forces, though outnumbered, fought fiercely from the hills and caves, making every step forward a battle in itself. The familiar sounds of gunfire, the rapid bursts of machine guns, and the explosions of grenades filled the air, a constant reminder that death was always just a moment away. Sam felt the weight of each step. He knew the men around him were counting on him, but it was becoming harder to hold on to the belief that there would be an end to the fighting. Every victory seemed to lead to another battle, and each one felt just as brutal as the last. One afternoon, as Sam was helping to clear a hillside, the roar of an artillery shell exploded nearby. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and he was thrown to the dirt, his body slamming against the rocky earth. The world seemed to spin around him, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He lay there, stunned, his mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. The sounds of the battle seemed to fade as he struggled to regain his bearings. When he finally managed to sit up, he realized that he had been thrown mere feet from a group of fallen soldiers. Some were still alive, their limbs twitching, while others lay still, their eyes wide open and unblinking. The sight hit him like a physical blow. He had seen death before, but never this close, never with this level of intimacy. He had been lucky to survive the blast, but those men, his comrades, had not been so fortunate. They had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now they were gone. Sam's throat tightened, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down. He had saved lives once, but he couldn't save them all. The reality of that fact settled deep into his chest, a heavy weight that he couldn't escape. Sam quickly turned his attention back to the task at hand, forcing the images of death from his mind. He had to keep moving forward. There was no time for grief, no room for hesitation. His comrades needed him, and the mission needed to be completed. The Japanese were relentless, and the war wasn't going to stop just because he felt defeated. But as he moved through the battle, a question lingered in his mind. What was the cost of this fight? He had already given so much, but how much more would he have to sacrifice before it was over? The days turned into weeks,
and the battle showed no signs of letting up. Sam continued to fight alongside his brothers in arms, but the toll was beginning to show. His body, though strong, was worn down by the constant struggle. His clothes were torn, his face caked with dust and grime, and his hands were raw from holding his rifle. He had stopped counting the number of men he had seen fall. It was just another part of the war, another part of the cost. But each loss, whether it was a friend, a comrade, or a civilian, took something from him. And with each loss, a little bit of his humanity seemed to slip away. Then came a day that Sam would never forget. The battle had raged on for days, but this particular afternoon felt different. The air was thick with smoke, the ground littered with the remnants of battle. Sam's unit was advancing toward a Japanese stronghold, a well-fortified position in the hills. As they neared the enemy's defenses, the soldiers began to retreat, slowly pulling back into the hills, preparing for a last stand. Sam's unit pushed forward, but something was different this time. There was an eerie quiet in the air, a tension that hung like a fog over the battlefield. When Sam reached the top of the hill, he was met with a scene that shocked him to his core. The enemy soldiers had abandoned their positions. But scattered among the remains of their fortifications were piles of civilian bodies, women and children, all lifeless. Sam's stomach turned as he realized the extent of the devastation. These people, caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for, had been slaughtered in cold blood. The sight of the dead, the innocent, made the war feel more pointless than ever. As he stood there, surveying the carnage, Sam realized that this was the true cost of war, the destruction of everything in its path. It wasn't just the soldiers who paid the price, it was everyone. The faces of the civilians, their wide, unblinking eyes, would haunt him for the rest of his life. They had been casualties of a war that never should have been. And Sam, despite everything he had endured, realized that no amount of victory could ever erase the pain of what had been lost. The war for Okinawa would eventually come to an end, but for Sam, the battle would never truly be over. The faces of the men, the women, and the children he had seen would stay with him forever. And as he returned home, carrying the weight of those memories, he would carry with him the understanding that some victories come at an unbearable cost. In the end, it wasn't the battles won or the lives saved that mattered most. It was the lives lost, and the burden of living with that loss that would define him.